Okay, I relocated back that strange whiteboard in the background. I was just in a room watching with Cynthia Haven where we could see on the big screen, but not a very beautiful background. So I hope everyone is coming back in now. And yes, we will move next to our very distinguished guest, Robert Haas, who I think I mentioned yesterday. I saw with Miłosz many years ago, and of course, all of us know how important this relationship was. But it was just, you could see it in Miłosz's face when Robert Haas walked in the room. He lit up, and I'm sure he responded that way when Lillian walked in the room too. I just this idea of, again, going back to Stanley, this community. I think that maybe he was able to construct something like that, and to the great benefit of all of us. So without further ado, I just want to turn things over to Robert. And thank you.
Thank you, Bill, very much. This has been such a pleasure, and it's really a pleasure to be here with Lillian and Stanley, who didn't mention that he did quite a bit of translating of the verse, because he, for Lucas Tischner's book on Miłosz and the problem of evil, there is a chapter on a poem of Miłosz's that has not been translated into English, which actually I've just recently been working on with David Frick. But I've been studying Stanley's parts of the translation of a poem that's about 12 pages long, a treatise on morality, Traktat Moralny, that I'm told is written in rhymed couplets and the style of a Krakow cabaret song. And Stanley had translated parts of that. Very grateful for that work. And so to pick up on the thing to say about Lillian's work that she didn't say is that she's become a profoundly important writer about her region. She's done just gorgeous work on the bioregional, on evoking the environment of her part of the valley of Northern California. To pick up on the story, so I was aware of Czesław for a long time. He was my neighbor. I had heard, and one of my best friends from grammar school and high school, Louis Irabarn, studied with him at Berkeley, and it made me aware again. I had read Everybody Did in my generation, The Captive Mind, and I'd looked at a first volume of his poems, and it didn't make an impression on me. The poems seemed, or the translation seemed muddy. So I didn't know what kind of poet he was. And I read an article in Essay in Books Abroad on things in the poetry of World War II. It was mostly about Herbert and Miłosz. And it quoted bits of a poem called The World. So I had heard that that there was a new manuscript of his poems around, and that had been rejected by a bunch of publishing houses. And I wrote to my editor at Echo, Dan Halpern, and said, this guy's supposed to be a great poet. Poems I've seen are not that great, but he's a major figure apparently. And besides having written The Captive Mind, and you should take a look at this. And Dan looked at it and took it immediately. And then I saw Bells in Winter, which is, one, it contains a lot of Czesław's best work. And second, it's a dazzling translation. Every line in it is just alive. And that was that combination of Lillian and Czesław doing that. And so out of that experience, I got to spend time with Czesław. And back to another part of our discussion, when people are asking about his relation to the Yiddish writing in Vilno, then he asked me to read the English at a reading he was doing at an international conference in San Francisco. One of the people who was there was Isaac Singer. And Czesław, for the first time, met Isaac Singer and mentioned that he was completely unaware of his work, in fact, completely unaware of Yiddish work in Vilnius and in Poland until he saw it in a bookstore in New York, translation of Singer. Anyway, I got to see the moment when these two men, old men then, but in terms of so Czesław must have been 70. He was going to be 20 more years writing. They fell passionately into conversation in Polish. It was a wonderful thing to watch. So I had asked Czesław, well, this poem that's called The World, what about it? And he said, oh, it's not translatable. It's written in the language of a child's primer. It rhymed, meter, it really can't be done. And someone had approached me, Michael Cudahy, the editor of one of the very good literary magazines of the 70s and 80s, Ironwood, and said, I want to do a special issue on Miłosz. What do you think? And I said, let me ask him if I can't try to do a translation of this poem called The World. And my friend Robert Pinsky, who's very a gifted craftsman, translator of Dante, I said, do you want to join me in trying to translate this untranslatable poem? And he said, sure. And Czesław said, well, actually, I do have a trot that I did with Lillian of this poem. And he handed it over to us, and we set to work on trying to translate this poem. And then he won the Nobel Prize one day, and his life changed. And the immediate way it changed was that large duffel bags of mail started arriving at the house on Grizzly Peak. I think everyone who he'd been in school with, first grade, second grade, third grade, wrote him a note. And he was a bit overcome by it. And Renata Gorczynski, who was then a journalist in New York, wrote to Czesław and said, do you need help? I can come out and give you a hand. And so she did. And I met Renata and thought, she's going to help me with this, reading aloud The World, so I can figure out what this poem sounds like. And I asked her about it. And she said, well, yes, of course, it's an amazing poem, but have you seen the stuff this guy is writing now? This would have been just 1980. And I said, no, I don't know. And she started doing sight translations of the separate notebooks, just amazing poems. And Bells in Winter had arrived. And I thought, oh my God, this guy is really a great poet. These are amazing poems. And so we started to work. I just found something that I had written back in 1980 about this early experience of, I can't say I was a translator. And then, I mean, I should finish that narrative thing. So we started to work on this. I worked with Renata and with Robert, and we did a book that included the separate notebook poems. And then, as it happened, Czesław and I continued to keep working. He kept writing. There was a whole body of work that had not been translated. And so for 20 years or 25, I would meet him on Monday mornings and he would have prepared a couple of poems, and we would sit down and try to make plausible versions in English. So I said, I'm not a translator so much as a English idiom consultant. And I'll read a little of this to give you a taste. Sometimes we acted merely as English idiom consultants for Czesław's own very strong translations of free verse poems, or those of our friend Renata Gorczynski. So working on a poem like bypassing Rue Descartes, I'd come across the phrase, let me make sense of this for you because I'm trying to contract something. We'd ask Renata, doing a sight translation, would say, how do you say, what's the English expression for that was over? Renata would say thoughtfully, how do you say a fashion was over, like a style of play that they don't produce anymore? And we would supply the phrase, it had been done. It had been done already. And so we'd get to these lines from Bypassing Rue Descartes about the people in Paris moving through a city full of historic statues. Meanwhile, the city behaved according to its nature. This is Renata translating. Rustling with throaty laughter in the dark, baking long breads, pouring wine into clay pitchers, buying fish, lemons, and garlic at street markets, completely indifferent to honor and shame and greatness and glory, because they had been done already and had transformed themselves into monuments representing no one knows who, into arias barely audible, and into turns of speech. To my ear, the catalog, it's a wonderful perception, but to my ear, the catalog in the second to fourth lines was not wonderful. Rustling with throaty laughter in the dark, baking long breads, pouring wine into clay pitchers, buying fish, lemons, and garlic at street markets. It lacks some internal echoing of sounds or structure in the parallelism that would make it memorable. And here, we would be brought up against a problem. Was the Polish memorable? Renata would read it to us aloud, which didn't help much. When you're learning a language, everything sounds good. So we would ask her if the lines were especially memorable. She would pull hard on a cigarette, say they're good. I wouldn't say they're the best things he ever wrote. Then they say what they say. They convey the rhythm of it. She read it again. There was no internal rhyme, no strong alliteration. There was some assonance. My understanding of our task, since we had to leave the issue of lexical accuracy to others, was something like equivalency of sound and form. But we had at first no feeling for the sound and form of the original. And though I felt later that I had developed it to a surprising degree under the circumstances, I could never be sure I wasn't deluding myself. So we not only had to take lexical accuracy for granted, we had, for anything but the grossest poetic effects, rhyme, a specific meter, heavy alliteration, to rely on a description of the effect we hoped to achieve. My ear, for example, would immediately hear an English language possibility, buying fish in the markets and lemon and garlic, giving the rhyme a little lilt and an internal rhyme. The rhyme, in the way that rhyme does, would bring the catalog to completion, rustling with throaty laughter in the dark, baking long breads, pouring wine in clay pitchers, buying fish in the markets and lemon and garlic. But I was not particularly licensed to do this. This is the thing that Stanley was talking about. There are two issues here. One is philosophy of translation. You can either bring the reader to the poem or bring the poem to the reader. You can let it sound a little foreign, or you could try to make it sound as if it was written in English. My impulse with Czesław was the latter, to make it sound, and then that involved interrogation. Is the level of diction high, middle, low? Would you say this in casual conversation? Does it so on? So there's that issue, the issue of the level of formality. And then the other one is, if the writing seems a little boring, do you try to improve it? Or if it seems blurred in some way, do you make it more focused? Again, this is in the English, not knowing what's happening exactly in the Polish. But I was not particularly licensed to do this. One could say that one was trying to make the best possible poem in English and go ahead. But filling the translations detail by detail by detail with one's own oral tics wasn't necessarily the way to do that. I would say to her, is it like a Whitman catalog? Her English after 4 or 5 years in Manhattan was heavily accented, but accurate and wonderfully reckless and she was surprisingly shrewd in her sense of the American poetry that she had read. Shorter, I would say it's shorter than a Whitman line, but is it like it? Does it sound something like it? She smoked and considered. I would say yes. Maybe it sounds like Saint-Jean-Perse. She would read the lines again. For me, it was frustrating getting at the line like making love with gloves on. I would look again. Are they pouring wine into clay pitchers or pouring wine from clay pitchers? I asked because I wanted pouring wine in clay pitchers rather than into. It helped to gang up the strong stresses, and it made a parallelism with buying fish in the markets, pouring wine in clay pitchers. She looked at the Polish. It's curious about Polish. It could be either. I said, I've never seen wine poured from a clay pitcher in Paris. No, she said, neither have I, but they must have done it in the cheap bistros in the 30s. Czesław would drop by sometimes in the late afternoon to see what we were up to. We talked for a while about the bistros of Paris and the little tobacco shops in the districts where Polish guest workers were housed during the Depression. The line he liked in English was buying fish, lemons, and garlic at street markets. He was not taken by my version. He liked the processional sound of fish, lemon, and garlic. We listened to English poetry. He listens to English poetry with an ear tuned to the rhythms of Polish and also French poetry, in which he has been deeply immersed. He's sensitive to strong stress, which is more characteristic of Russian than of Polish verse, I'm told, and I think he distrusts a little. Hearing my phrasing, he smiled, did a little imitation of a jig with the movement of his head. I like it. It sounds like an English music hall song. Fish in the markets and lemons and garlic. That was his form of veto. We stayed with the first version. Still sounds flat to me, but it's his poem. So that's a little of what it was like at the start. I also found something to continue on this subject that I had written 10 years later about translating one of the poems. I don't know if Esther is still with us.
Yes. Would you like me to show the?
I don't know if you can put a copy of the text up.
Yes, one moment.
So this was a poem written around 1990. And it's called, I'll read the English. The Polish title, forgive my pronunciation of the Polish, is Trwałczyk. Lastingness. That was in a big city. no matter what country, what language, a long time ago. Blessed be the gift of spinning a tale out of a trifle in the street, in a car. I write it down not to lose it. Perhaps not a trifle, a crowded night cafe where every evening a famous chanteuse used to sing. I was sitting with others in smoke, the clatter of beer glasses, ties, officers' uniforms, deep décolleté of women, with music of their folklore, probably from the mountains, and that singer, her throat, a pulsating stem, her dancing movement, the black of her hair, white of her skin, the imagined scent of her perfumes. What have I learned since? What have I discovered? States, customs, lives, gone. No trace of her or of that cafe, and only her shade with me, her frailty, beauty, always. So collaborating on the translation of poems from a language one doesn't know is a very curious business. My knowledge of Polish is sufficiently advanced that if I see a poem entitled Snake and the English translation is entitled Foot, I can recognize some radical decision has been made by my co-translator. This would occasionally happen, that Czesław, the poem in English was different from what it looked like to me, the Polish text to be. And I said, seems like there's something about your father in this. And he said, yeah, I cut that for the English text. But I'm confronted with a title like Travashik that means nothing to me, and to which he has given the English title Durability. And the process begins there. This poem, written in free verse, would have presented no particular formal obstacles, or rather it would have presented the usual ones. What really does Travashik mean? And is there an English equivalent? And what is one to do with sound? My eye moves to the line, the English version. Her dancing movements, the black of her hair, the white of her skin. And I can see, for one thing, immediately the addition of articles, the black of her skin, the white of her hair. And I think, as usual, that there is nothing to be done. In English, the articles and the are tyrannical, and so is the position of the pronomial adjective her. What sounds to me like a rapid cascade of sound in the Polish is going to be rather more like a meandering stream of sound in English. When I began working with the strange and delicious sounds of this language, I was always tempted to omit the articles. Her dancing movement, black of her hair, white of her skin, or her dancing motion, black hair, white skin. But it makes everything too intense. And I've learned to use this manner sparingly, and when we both thought it was called for. There were 4 or 5 small problems. In line 5, there is no comfortable way to translate the sense of bow because into English without complicating the syntax, i.e., since it's crowded, best just to omit it. In the same line, we discuss the distinction in English between a cafe and a nightclub. My old McLaughlin's Polish English dictionary in 2 parts offers neither word in English. What a sad world Mr. McLaughlin must have lived in. So we settle a little uneasily on night cafe. I say, probably it should just be cafe. No, he thinks it doesn't make it clear what kind of place it was. Well, okay, there are no night cafes in England or America, but we'll go with it. The theory of this is that it's better to give a slightly exotic feel to the English than to suggest that all social customs between 2 cultures are identical and therefore entirely translatable. Folklore is also a problem, since in English, folk music and folklore are quite distinct. So we try wild music of the folk. Meanwhile, there is kruchos. Does one translate and only her shade with me, frailty, beauty, always, or and only her shadow with me. And where do you put the emphasis? And with me, only her shadow, her frailty, her beauty, always, or and only a shade with me, frailty, beauty, always. They all sound gorgeous and they all sound slightly different, one more tender than another in its feeling. A bit regretfully, we choose the second option, feeling that in English, the word frailty, without the specifying her, is a little abstract, a little French. But this is, to use an American idiom, a close call. And at that, we are finished. Until months later, I'm asked to compose a little note for the poem, and I talked to Czesław about it once again. A friend has protested to me that durability feels wrong. Durable is what you say about leather goods. A friend, I say durability is a word you'd apply to a manufactured object. It's true, some trustworthy piece of equipment. Let me check with Czesław again. I asked him and he said, well, endurance or persistence, dictionary gave, but neither seems right. Endurance has associations with marathon races. Persistence is stubbornness, keeping at it. Czesław broods and says, it means to last. I say, what about to last or what lasts as a title? He says, well, when I first translated it, I tried lastingness, but I guess that's too odd. And I said, oh no, that's great. I like lastingness. And he says, good, we're finished. So, should I read the poem once again? No, let it go at that. So, there are endless stories. Translating The World, the poem, The World, which is an astonishing piece of work. And we were told that it was untranslatable. And I can give you a little of that, if that's interesting. I have it here. So, one of the poems is called The Path. And here's a literal version that he did with Lillian. There where the green valley unfurls down a path overgrown with grass. The thing about I guess you all know it, but just to say, it's the middle of the Nazi occupation of Warsaw, in the middle of the horror. The poets and the writers are getting together in small groups before the curfew to read each other work. Most of it is, he says in The Captive Mind, most of the writing of that time borrowed from the heroic sense of resistance and self-definition out of resistance that came in French poetry and French fiction at this time, though, in fact, French culture had more or less completely capitulated to its occupiers. Anyway, there where the green, then this odd magical poem, an idyll in the middle of the violence. There where the green valley unfurls down a path overgrown with grass, through an oak grove just beginning to bloom, children are on their way home from school. In a pencil case that slides open, crayons grate against bits of a roll and a copper penny, which each child saves to greet the first spring cuckoo. Sister's beret and brother's cap bob amid the fluffy brushwood. A screeching jay hops in the branches and long clouds drift over the trees. Now you can see the red roof beyond the bend. In front of the house is father, leaning on a hoe. He stoops to touch the unfolding leaves, and from his patch sees the entire region. So Robert Pinsky had a go at doing the rhyme translation, found a tone and a style. Try this. Down where the green valley opens wider, along the path with grass blurring its border, through an oak grove just broken into flower, children come walking home from school together. I guess that's enough to make my example. I can't find it. So we read it to Czesław and he said, modern rhyme. Wasn't very happy with it. Didn't sound enough, sounded too sophisticated, the rhyming. How the hell are we supposed to tell sophisticated from unsophisticated rhyming? So there is another poem in the sequence called Parable of a Poppy Seed, which is imagined to be a bedtime song or story that the mother tells to the two children, the brother and sister. The sense of the first stanza is, on a seed of poppy is a tiny house. Inside it are people and a cat. Outside in the yard, a dog barks at the moon. He doesn't know he lives in a poppy seed world. Roughly, I think. So I was child's primer. I tried a child's primer. On a seed of poppy is a tiny house. Outside on a seed of poppy is a tiny house. Inside it are people, a cat and a mouse. Outside in the yard, a dog barks at the moon. And then in his one world, he sleeps until noon. The earth is a poppy seed and nothing more. And that seed's a planet, and that seed's a star. And even if there were 100,000, each would contain a house and a garden, all in a poppy head. They grow taller than hay. The children run through and the poppy plants sway. And in the night, when the moon is aloft, you hear the dog barking, first loud, then soft. I thought, well, pretty good. And I showed it to Czesław when he came back from his lectures. And he said, mouse? There is no mouse in my poem. So one of the things about working with him was that he wanted the rhyme poems to rhyme, but he hated it if it departed from his meaning. You need to be told that poppy plants grow taller than hay. Anyway, it was not successful, that effort. I guess that's enough of giving you some sense of the work. At the moment, I'm working on, with David Frick, who teaches Polish in the Slavic language department at Berkeley, on a translation of this untranslated poem. There is the treatise on poetry and the treatise on morals, and lots of people have said, well, where's the treatise on morality? It's really interesting in relation to the conversations we've been having, because it happens with writing about writers in general, that you sort of, did he believe this? Did he think that? Is this an example of this or an example of that? And he is literally saying, so full of contradictions. Thinking about Stanley's remarks, I thought, well, one of his one-line poem goes from birth to death, ecstasy at sunrise. That's the ecstatic embodied Miłosz. And it's where, as Lillian was saying, it's really where his gift is, his genius as a writer is a lot like Tolstoy's. Everything he touches in a couple of lines comes alive. You don't know, how do you do that? Who knows? And then the other thing is that he both loved and hated the embodied world that he was so good at evoking, and from early on, from an early poem like Encounter, was at the same time obsessed with the, I don't know if the word is fragility, but the disappearance of the world. Where on earth does everything go is the question he asks over and over again. And arguing that someday, some point, it's all going to become clear to him that the world is going to be saved entirely. So the other one, so From Birth to Death, Ecstasy at Sunrise, half a page later, Pinned to the Cosmos by the Black Pin of Sex. His relationship to, sometime in the 80s, people would approach me to ask him if he would do things like a big fundraising poetry reading to oppose a nuclear power plant, this California, built on an earthquake fault. And I said to Czesław, if you're going to do one thing, this will be at the cathedral on top of the hill in San Francisco. It would be a great venue. They would love to have you read just a poem. He said, I don't really like anti-nukes. And I said, what do you mean you don't like anti-nukes? And he said, blue hair. Yes, what? Blue hair. 1 minute, a beautiful little girl. Next minute, an old lady with blue hair. 1 minute, a fast-running little boy. Next minute, an old man stooped over, barely walking. Who protests? No one is protesting this. So that was Czesław on nature. Another time, it was another environmental kind of, as it would be in the Bay Area, environmental kind of reading. This with this body of work, with its amazing richness of naturalist eye. And he said, of course, to me, nature is pure horror, which is the theme of Diary of a Naturalist. And I said, what do you mean, pure horror? You were just up in the Napa Valley. You were describing doing a hot tub up there as the vines were changing on the hill. And he said, beauty, different story. So part of him loved the world. Part of him thought it was monstrous. And he, part of him thought that language could recover of it. Some of it thought it can't quite. That image, I forget who read that this morning, that the poet is like a bird thrashing at a transparent window. I ran through yards of silk thinking that I was going to come to the last door because I believed there was a last door. The whole business of Miłosz and place, in a way, that is the final place of his poetry, the place where you can't quite get through the last door into the place in which things make sense. Anyway, enough, I think, for my remarks about this amazing poet and his amazing body of work.
Can I just type a comment to him? Just to let him. I just want to just.
Thank you. That was just fascinating. I just want to, I think Bożena's, yes, there she is. I just wanted to help with the transition there. So Bożena is going to pose the question here.
Well, first of all, it was such a treat. It really was wonderful. Thank you so much. Something that I will remember. One of the themes in your monologue was the question of those poems that are untranslatable. And I would like to know whether you have ever contemplated to translate Miłosz's Waltz, a masterful poem that I would like to know what were your thoughts about this poem in terms of translating it.
Yeah, I've asked somebody, a Polish reader, Adam Zagajewski, in fact, would you just give me a kind of sight translation so I get a sense of what's in it? And so I have a sense of what's in it. And at that time, I thought it would be good with all of these poems that are particularly admired by Polish readers that have not been translated to have a trot anyway, word for word translation so people could see what's there. And now it's possible with almost every poem to include an online sound reading to get what the sound of it actually is. So there would be a way of doing that. But I thought, I don't want to do, I'm going to have, the person who does that should be someone who's Polish, can do the Polish accurately, because it doesn't matter too much what happens in the English. I don't think it can be reproduced, but maybe it can. Maybe the right American poet or English poet can actually make a waltz version of waltz. That would be a pleasure. Another poem that they say is difficult for that reason is Toast, which is the poem I think about his school classmates. And I'm finding it with trying to do this translation of Traktat Moralny. It's an incredibly interesting moment in his life. He's in Washington, D.C. He's seen Warsaw. Well, I guess he left as it was being blown up, but Warsaw had been blown up block by block. And then he's in Washington, D.C. and people are going by in Packard convertibles with cream-colored hubs and playing Glenn Miller songs on the radio. And there are black men selling watermelon on street corners. And behind him is a world destroyed. And he's a communist diplomat in New York, he was in New York and in Washington, just as the Cold War is heating up. And he knew what he was getting into by taking this job. And then reads W.H. Auden's New Year letter, a poem in rhymed couplets, sort of summing up the condition of the world in the post-war. And he sets out to write this moral treatise. The book that he had published, do you say Osolenie? Is that how you say salvation, or?
Ocalenie.
So the first lines of the treatise on morality go, they're in quotation marks. Just what, O poet, do you propose to rescue or save, I guess? I don't know which you would choose. Just what, O poet, do you choose to rescue? Is there anything that can rescue the earth? This so-called dawn of peace and progress, what has it given us? A few morning glories among the ruins. It's given hope's bile, given the heart cunning, and I doubt that it's aroused much pity. That's the first stanza of this poem that goes on in what I'm told are jaunty, comic, playful rhymes for 12 pages, sorting out after the war. It's doubly interesting because the American narrative of 1945 and 46 is triumph. The war is over, the depression is over, the economy is restoring, and the Polish narrative is catastrophe followed by catastrophe. And living under an occupation army for 4 or 5 years doesn't cultivate the American virtues of sincerity and straightforwardness. So he begins this lecture on it, and it's in rhyme. And it's, as I'm reading it with David, Frick was reading it out loud, laughing at the rhymes and pointing out how clever they are. And we realize we're getting none of that, not getting any of it in the writing here. But it seems worth doing just because of the incredible drama of that moment when he's still a kind of Hegelian, not sure if he's a Marxist. He certainly nothing about being a Catholic or having an absolute or a transcendent against at this moment in his development. So anyway, fascinating as all of his work is.
Well, thank you. Since Waltz is a poem that recalls his birthday, his birth, but also goes much further to some cataclysm. I just think that somebody should very soon translate this poem into English, and in a way that would be enjoyable to the English readers. But for me, this poem, if I may share with you, my impression is so difficult because there is this masterful interconnectivity between the form and the imagery. It is, and the rhythm that changes from the waltz rhythm to march.
Mm-hmm.
It is just almost, I mean, it sounds crazy how to translate it. But anyway, this poem is on the top of my list of